Darkness falls. The wind, blowing from the north, emits a shrill, relentless sound as it sweeps through the wooden huts. Smoke rises slowly from the stone chimneys. In the courtyards, the last animals are being herded into the barns. The winter of the Middle Ages has arrived. About 1,000 years ago, for people living across much of Europe, winter was not merely a season, but a test. Survival required careful planning, social solidarity, and the will to withstand the full harshness of nature. In this documentary, we will explore how the winter season was experienced in the medieval world, spanning roughly the years 500 to 1500, and how people coped with the cold, scarcity, and darkness. We will shed light on the lives of people from all walks of life, from peasants to lords, from monks to knights, during this harsh season. For the medieval peasant, winter preparation began with the very first days of autumn. In the weeks following St. Martin's Day in November, a great slaughter ceremony took place in the villages. This ritual was among the most important of the year. Animals that could not be fed through winter or would be of no use in spring were killed, and their meat was salted, smoked, or stored in frozen cellars. The pig held a central importance in this process. In the Middle Ages, pork was the primary source of protein to meet nutritional needs during the winter months. Every part of the pig, its skin, fat, intestines, was used in the kitchen. Nothing was wasted. Grain storage was equally critical. Cellars and grain barns were carefully filled immediately after the autumn harvest. Rye, barley, and oats were the most common grains of the era. Wheat was grown mostly by wealthier farmers and monasteries. Protecting grains from moisture and rats was vitally important to surviving the winter in good health. Monasteries were most advanced in this regard. Through written records and experienced monks, methods refined over years were employed. In the forests, a great campaign of firewood gathering took place. In the Middle Ages, wood was not so much a fuel in the modern sense, as it was life itself. Heating, cooking, forging iron, firing ceramics, all these activities depended on wood. Lords and the church strictly controlled access to the forests. A peasant's right to cut trees in certain areas was part of the feudal contract. Sometimes only permission to collect fallen branches was granted. Even so, people stacked as much wood as they could every autumn, because a dying hearth in the middle of winter could mean death. The typical medieval village home looks remarkably modest by modern eyes. Single-room structures built mostly on stone or timber frames, with wattle and daub housed both humans and animals. This practice had a practical reason. The body heat of animals helped raise the temperature of the house. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth or fireplace was located in the center or middle of the walls, and a hole was left in the roof to exhaust the smoke. A true chimney system first emerged around the 12th century and spread first in monasteries and castles. Windows were the privilege only of churches and castles. In ordinary homes, windows were closed with wooden shutters or animal hides. This allowed light in while keeping the wind out. However, the more light such a method admitted, the more cold it also let in. So in winter, homes were often dim and smelled of smoke, while people layered as many clothes as possible or huddled together for warmth. Beds also played a critical role in heat retention. Wealthy families used feather quilts and thick woolen blankets. The poor wrapped themselves in straw-stuffed mattresses or pieces of animal fur. Sleeping together, with family members, servants, and sometimes guests, was both a practical and cultural reality. While this habit seems strange from a modern viewpoint, it was entirely normal for medieval people. Medieval castles, meanwhile, offered different but equally challenging conditions. Built from stone, these structures remained cool in summer, but became freezing cold in winter. Even if great fireplaces burned for hours, heating the entirety of large halls was nearly impossible. Lords and their ladies covered their walls with large rugs and textiles to keep their rooms warm and had wooden inner walls constructed. What appeared to be decorative applications were in fact methods of thermal insulation. What was on the winter table? This question varied enormously depending on one's place in the social hierarchy of the time. The gulf separating the banquet table of a medieval nobleman and the daily meal of a serf was a reflection not only of economic, but also of legal reality. For peasants, the winter diet was monotonous and restricted. Porridges and bread made from various grains formed the basis of nutrition. This bread was mostly made from rye or barley, while bread made from white wheat flour was scarce and valued. Root vegetables, onions, cabbage, and turnips that could keep for long periods were stored on cellar shelves. Legumes, peas, lentils, and beans provided a critical source of protein. However, when stocks ran out during long winters, the population could be driven into severe famine. Salt was as valuable as wealth in the medieval world. Salting meat and fish made it possible to consume animal protein throughout winter. Herring, especially in northern Europe, was a staple food source throughout winter. Salted or smoked, it could keep for months. Given the church's prohibition on meat on Fridays and fasting periods, fish consumption was not only a matter of nutrition but also of religious obligation. Beverages like beer and fruit juices were indispensable to daily life. Since finding clean drinking water could sometimes be difficult in the Middle Ages, lightly fermented beers and cider were common consumption drinks. These beverages were relatively safer alternatives against waterborne diseases. For the wealthy, wine, especially from southern Europe, was at the center of the table. Spiced wine, known as hippocras, was valued both as a warming drink and as a symbol of prestige. In monasteries, the picture was somewhat different. Monks survived on soups prepared with herbs grown in their own gardens, grain-based dishes, and small amounts of meat or fish. The rules of the Benedictine order strictly regulated meal times and quantities. During Advent and Lent, fasting became even more intense. Winter was a season when work slowed in agricultural societies, but that did not mean no work was done at all. While fields were covered with snow or frozen ground, peasants turned to work that could be done indoors or in enclosed spaces. Repairing tools, weaving baskets and objects from rushes or willow branches, spinning and weaving wool. All of these were the ordinary occupations of the winter months. Women worked particularly intensively in spinning and weaving. These crafts both met the family's needs and sometimes generated income by being sold at market. Men occupied themselves with woodwork, doors, tables, plow handles, carts. Blacksmiths never let their forges go cold. Repairing or renewing metal tools was indispensable winter work. This process was not only practical, but also a social activity. Villagers would sometimes gather at each other's workshops or homes, chatting, sharing stories and songs while they worked. Winter nights, especially in December and January, had extremely limited daylight. In the north, some regions would see the sun for only a few hours. Since candles and torches were expensive and limited resources, light had to be used carefully. People would sleep shortly after sunset, wake in the middle of the night, do small tasks or pray, and then sleep again. Historian Roger Ekirch has shown that this practice of segmented sleep was common in the Middle Ages and consisted of 2 separate sleep periods following each other. For children, winter was both frightening and somehow magical. Little ones who had not yet grasped the meaning of the seasons clung to the winter tales and mythological stories told by their elders. On long dark nights, grandmothers and elderly villagers would tell stories by the fireside. The traces of this tradition are clearly visible in Nordic mythology and in many folk tales collected later. One of the greatest enemies of the medieval winter was disease. People living together in enclosed and poorly ventilated spaces created fertile ground for the spread of germs. Respiratory diseases, bronchitis and pneumonia, significantly increased mortality rates during winter months. Medieval medicine had very limited means against these diseases. The treatment approach, based on the 4 humors theory of Galenic medicine, recommended warm and dry foods, hot drinks, and medicinal herbs against diseases classified as cold and moist during winter. While hypothermia is a modern concept, death from cold was a real and frequent danger in the Middle Ages. When inadequate heating, poor nutrition, and physical exhaustion combined, especially the elderly and children could easily lose their lives in severe cold. For beggars, travelers, and those without shelter, freezing to death on the road was one of the ordinary tragedies of winter. Against this, churches and monasteries served as a social support network. Benedictine monasteries in particular considered it a duty to offer food and shelter to the poor and travelers throughout winter. The guest house sections, known as hospitium, opened their doors to everyone from traveling clergy to poor wayfarers. These institutions were not merely religious spaces, but also the supporting pillars of the medieval social welfare system. Epidemic diseases such as smallpox, measles, and dysentery could sometimes devastate communities during winter months. The Black Death, the bubonic plague epidemic that ravaged Europe in the 14th century, first spread in warm seasons, but continued its effect through the following winters, with the death toll counted in the millions. These experiences deepened medieval people's sense of helplessness against nature and the fear of death that winter represented. The picture in the great halls of castles was different. Although the winter of medieval nobles cannot be directly compared to the hardships endured by peasants, it was not entirely free from difficulties. The fireplaces burning in great halls served a symbolic and social function, rather than providing effective heating. Lords and their guests would gather at enormous tables, passing the evening with romances read aloud and songs sung by troubadours. Tournaments and nightly competitions continued to be organized throughout winter, as much as the weather allowed. These events were not merely entertainment. They were also platforms where nobles reaffirmed their status, alliances were consolidated, and politics took shape. In medieval Europe, winter was also seen as the end of the campaign season. Launching expeditions was generally left to spring and summer due to harsh conditions. This made life in castles somewhat more subdued in one sense. Noble ladies spent these long winter days mainly at needlework. Silk embroideries, religious needlework dedicated to great cathedrals, and tapestries bearing family coats of arms were woven throughout winter. These crafts were not so much a way to pass the time as they were part of the identity of a devout and skilled woman in keeping with the expectations of the court and church. Head cooks and kitchen staff were perhaps busiest during winter of all seasons throughout the year. Christmas celebrations and feasts coinciding with important holy days required hours of food preparation. Everything from partridge to crane, from carp to base, was brought to the table. Spices, cinnamon, cloves, ginger were used both to flavor dishes and for medicinal reasons. This use of spices was also a mark of wealth, for spices were commodities that came from the east via long routes and were extremely expensive. For medieval people, winter was not only a physical struggle, but also a period carrying deep religious significance. In the Christian calendar, winter was an extremely busy period in terms of spiritual preparation and celebration. The Advent season, the 4-week period before Christmas, was a time of fasting, prayer, and collecting charity for the poor. During this period, some congregations would give up meat and dairy products and devote more time to prayer. Christmas celebrations were a burst of light within winter. December 25th was celebrated not only as the birthday of Christ, but also as the symbol that the longest night of the year had passed. Churches were illuminated with candlelight. Hymns were sung. Banquet tables were set. These celebrations sometimes spread over 12 days and continued until the beginning of January, known as Twelfth Night. In villages, these days saw masked plays, dances, and folk entertainments. The roots of these traditions sometimes extended back to pagan ceremonies. Saints' days were also important stops in the winter calendar. St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, St. John's Day, December 27th, and Holy Innocents' Day, December 28th, each celebrated with its own distinct traditions and religious practices. On some of these days, churches held services, while on others, markets were set up. People both prayed and socialized on these occasions. Winter's symbolic importance also left deep marks in medieval art. Figures representing the seasons on cathedral walls and calendar miniatures in manuscripts typically depicted winter as an old man seated by a hearth or as snow-covered fields. These images were reflections of a worldview that connected the natural cycle of seasons to a divine order and positioned humanity within that cycle. In the medieval European winter, monasteries held a special place. These institutions were the centers not only of religious life, but also of agriculture, education, healthcare, and social welfare. Monasteries belonging particularly to the Benedictine and Cistercian orders possessed highly developed systems for meeting and planning for winter in advance and in an organized manner. Monastery gardens were home to the most advanced agricultural knowledge of the Middle Ages. Medicinal plants, culinary herbs, and vegetables were cultivated with careful irrigation, fertilization, and rotation methods. Maintenance of these gardens during winter months was an integral part of the monastery calendar. Even in a snow-covered garden, attempts were made to grow plants in heated structures similar to greenhouses. The scriptorium, the writing workshop, was the most intensively working section during winter. With agricultural activities reduced in this period, monks devoted more time to copying and illuminating manuscripts. However, This work was done in freezing cold rooms with frozen fingers. Some monastery records report that inkpots froze and monks were forced to warm their hands. Despite these conditions, the manuscripts produced are among the most valuable treasures of today's museums and libraries. In the monastery church, winter months were filled with multiple daily worship services. Rising before dawn was the measure of prayer. This disciplined life kept monks occupied both physically and spiritually, and allowed them to spend long winter nights in prayer, thanksgiving, and meditation. Throughout the Middle Ages, some winters were particularly severe and left such devastating marks that they entered historical records. These catastrophic winters left deep traces not only meteorologically, but also socially and economically. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was one of the greatest humanitarian disasters the medieval Europe had ever known. Successive rainy and cold summers led to the rotting of grain fields. The bitterly cold winters that followed depleted existing food stocks. Millions of people perished across northern Europe. Chronicles report that people ate their horses and dogs, and in some places the dead were left unburied. This period is regarded by historians as the symbol of the end of the medieval warm period and the first signs of the Little Ice Age. The Great Freeze of the Rhine, 763 to 764, appears in many medieval chronicles. This extraordinary winter, in which the Rhine River froze completely solid and became walkable, paralyzed transport and trade routes across Europe. Similarly, the winter of 1709, also known as the Great Winter, while belonging to a period after the end of the Middle Ages, represents the peak of the Little Ice Age and is worth studying as an extension of the medieval winter tradition. Olive groves froze in France. The Venice Lagoon iced over, a thick sheet of ice formed on the Baltic Sea. During these severe winter years, the population was far more vulnerable because there was insufficient storage infrastructure. The depletion of food stocks struck the most fragile segments of society: children, the elderly, and the poor, in a merciless manner. The spring following these periods sometimes brought not hope, but a greater disaster. Outbreaks of plague and dysentery. The medieval winter was not made up solely of hardship and deprivation. This long and dark season was also the time of communal celebrations, storytelling, and social cohesion. When people were forced together, this necessity transformed into a tradition that nourished the community. Many winter ceremonies had a structure rooted in pre-Christian pagan rituals, but gradually assimilated or transformed by the Church. In Northern Europe, the winter solstice celebration known as Yule included practices of lighting fire, praying and singing over large logs, the Yule log. The traces of these ceremonies are clearly visible in the shaping of Christmas tradition. Hanging winter plants such as mistletoe and holly in homes was a practice widespread in the Middle Ages and partly of pagan origin. Winter markets were held in many European cities, especially in Germany and France, in December. These markets were lively social spaces where crafts, local foods, and spices were bought and sold. This tradition, continuing today as the Christmas market, has deep roots extending back to the Middle Ages. Masked plays and mummers, plays organized in village squares and castle courtyards, were indispensable entertainments of December and January. In these plays, the symbolic struggle of good and evil, life and death, winter and summer was staged. Players dressed in bizarre costumes would knock on their neighbors' doors. This tradition still survives in some regions. Troubadours and traveling storytellers also gained special importance during winter. People gathered in castle halls or village homes on long nights, listened to tales of heroism, love poems, and magical stories. This oral culture kept alive the history, values, and imagination of people who had no access to written sources. The climate history of the Middle Ages cannot be reduced to a single picture. The medieval warm period, lasting from approximately 950 to 1250 AD, meant relatively mild winters and bountiful harvests in Europe. During this period, the Vikings colonized Iceland and Greenland. Viticulture advanced northward in the south. The population grew rapidly. However, from the 13th century onward, the climate slowly began to cool, and by the 16th century, the period known as the Little Ice Age made itself fully felt. During this process, European winters became increasingly longer and more severe. The Thames froze repeatedly from 1607 to 1814, and frost fairs were organized on this frozen river. From Spain to Scandinavia, agricultural productivity declined. Combined with plague epidemics, this climatic pressure significantly reduced the European population of the 14th century. This climatic transition also found its reflections in medieval art. The painting Hunters in the Snow by Flemish artist Peter Bruegel, created at the end of the 16th century, conveys the Little Ice Age winter with extraordinary realism. Frozen rivers, trees bent under heavy snow, and weary hunters walking across a snowy plain. This painting is not merely a picture, it is the climatic memory of its era. The medieval climatic transition should be evaluated not only as a meteorological event but also as a historical turning point. Cooling winters triggered famines. Famines laid the ground for epidemics. Epidemics shook the social order. The most dramatic consequence of this chain effect was the Black Death epidemic of 1347 to 1351 that claimed a third of Europe's population. Evaluating the medieval winter solely from a Western European perspective remains incomplete. People experiencing this season in different corners of the world faced vastly different cultural, climatic, and economic conditions. In Scandinavia, winter was existence itself. Long, dark, and freezing winters played a central role in shaping Viking culture. The climates of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark forced people to be both extremely resilient and communal. The longhouse structures known as longhouses sheltered multiple families and animals under a single roof. Shared warmth and collective resources were the key to survival. Midwinter celebrations were marked with rituals such as lighting fires and offering sacrifices to Odin and other gods. Some of these ceremonies, performed on the longest night in the heart of winter, survived even after the acceptance of Christianity. In the Byzantine Empire, winter carried a different character. The relatively mild climate of Constantinople was far from the harshness of Western Europe. However, the interior regions of Anatolia and the Balkans struggled with severe winters. In the Byzantine court, winter ceremonies were intertwined with the empire's Christian identity. Christmas celebrations and fasting periods determined by the Orthodox calendar of the time set the rhythm of court life. In the Islamic world, while winter was not as harsh as in Western Europe across much of the Middle East, it was extremely challenging on the Central Asian steppes and the Iranian plateau. The accounts of Arab geographer Ibn Battuta and other medieval travelers illuminate how winter conditions shaped trade routes and altered caravan paths. Turkish tribes living in Anatolia and the Caucasus would move within the framework of the summer pasture-winter pasture migration tradition, driving their herds down to winter quarters. This tradition was an integral part of pre-Ottoman Turkish Islamic culture. How did medieval artists depict winter? This question contains remarkably illuminating answers regarding the visual culture of the period. Calendar miniatures in manuscripts provide the richest visual sources on this subject. The manuscript known as Très riche Heures du Duc de Berry, prepared by the Limbourg brothers at the beginning of the 15th century, contains one of the most accomplished examples of medieval winter iconography. The page depicting February shows a snow-covered village scene, peasants collecting firewood, and figures warming by a hearth. These depictions carry not only artistic, but also anthropological value. They are rare visual records documenting daily life of the period. The seasonal cycles carved in stone on medieval cathedrals also depicted the seasons. The cycle of the seasons depictions on Gothic cathedral portals typically symbolized winter through a peasant chopping wood or an elderly person warming by a fire. These images symbolize the cyclical structure of divine order and humanity's place within that order. The winter theme was also treated in fresco art. Italian frescoes began showing increasing interest in nature depictions during the late Middle Ages. Giotto and the masters who followed in his footsteps reflected the atmosphere of the seasons while incorporating landscape elements into religious scenes. This tendency was a harbinger of the Renaissance's focus on nature and the human figure. By the end of the 15th century, the changes heralding the closing of the Middle Ages were arriving one after another. The invention of the printing press, the discovery of the New World, the Reformation movements, and the rise of the Renaissance accelerated the pace of social and cultural transformation. Yet a great part of the winter tradition crossed this threshold into the modern age. The medieval-rooted rituals of Christmas celebrations are still preserved in many European countries today. Germany's Weihnachtsmarkt tradition, the history of the Santa Claus figure rooted in Saint Nicholas, the symbolic importance of mistletoe, and the Christmas tree, all of these are medieval legacies. Likewise, celebrations shaped around the winter solstice continue their existence under different forms and names. The practice of agricultural winter preparation also maintains a deep continuity. Methods such as pickling and smoking, fermentation and preserving, though industrialized by the modern food industry, at their core carry the wise foresight of the Middle Ages, storing the abundance of good times for the lean ones. Communal warmth, solidarity, and neighborliness. These are the most ancient human lessons that winter has taught. When the medieval peasant knocked on a neighbor's door, they were seeking not merely a neighbor, but the shared insurance of survival. This simple yet profound truth has traveled across the centuries to reach us today. The snow begins to fall again. Smoke rises from chimneys. Centuries ago, the same snow fell, the same smoke, the same chimney, the same human warmth. The medieval winter reminds us how new and how fragile our modern comforts truly are. Those people, facing cold, darkness, famine, and disease, did not merely survive. They built, they created art, they prayed, they sang, and they held each other's hands. This resilience is the most deeply rooted and most silent heroism humanity has ever shown throughout history. Winter returns every year, and every time it returns, it carries the voices of those people who once walked across frozen fields in the past.